Okay, great. Go ahead.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first Google Hangout of the Responding to 9/11 course. Uh, Today, it's going to be me and some of our fellow students from around the world, which is great. Some of our other Google Hangouts will have a guest, and I'll do a video interview with them, and then also open it up for questions. So watch out for postings from Justin about the ones that will come in subsequent weeks. Uh, Hopefully, we'll try to focus on the topic of the week, but also sometimes there are going to be things in the news. And of course, this week we've covered so much territory that I think we'll have a very wide-ranging discussion. I think ones in the future will be a little bit more focused. Of course, at least here in North America, the big issue is the terrible incident in Ottawa, where we had a gunman, an individual who appears to have been a recent convert to Islam, go on a rampage where he killed a soldier who was essentially someone standing guard at a memorial, and then was able to get into the Canadian Parliament building, fire off multiple gunshots, and he was eventually killed by the sergeant at arms, not somebody who was necessarily a policeman, but who, as I understand it, went to his office and retrieved a firearm and was able to kill the intruder. So it was definitely a shocking incident. Let me make a couple points, and if any of our students want to delve into that further, we can, or we can move on to other topics. First of all, this kind of shows how small numbers of people can cause a lot of harm and fear. So even though this phenomenon is, especially in North America or maybe more so in Europe, but still, people who believe in this ideology and who are willing to engage in violence are, very few numbers of people. They can cause great fear and get a lot of media attention, but that's the nature of terrorism. It is spectacular, and it is designed to make people fearful and also give the impression that the movement has more power and greater following than it actually does. So one of the challenges for societies, especially democracies with a free press and due process in their criminal justice system and protections on domestic spying on individuals, is how do we keep in mind how that is the tactic that is being used just for this purpose, to create fear and then also overreaction. And that's a very, very big challenge, and we'll be talking about issues like this as the course goes along. Second is an issue that we talked a lot more in the prior course, but we touched upon a little bit this week, which is how do these lone wolf actors, these individuals who they get inspired, they don't have any connection with actual terrorist organizations, but they are in the diaspora, they are maybe viewing materials over the internet, and they get promoted to engaging in violence. For a while, and a lot of people were perpetrating this idea that there was some sort of radicalization process that that could be tracked and had very clear, definitive stages. Was always a one-way progression where someone, started believing in the ideology, then they started taking on more strict religious practices, and then they started working with other people and plotting attacks, and then they hit the pinnacle and they started to engage in violence. And this was a progression through stages of radicalization and religiosity, and that people who held these radical ideas were inexorably going to be led ultimately to violence, because that's where the ideology takes you. I think that theory was really never supported by a strong research basis, and I think it's incidents like this that show how invalid that is. This individual couldn't have had this long progression through religiosity because he wasn't even a Muslim until very recently. And the research shows that it's not inexorable that people who hold radical ideas about the position of Muslims vis-a-vis the West, or critiques of Western foreign policy, or even the idea that it's justified to use violence to perpetrate certain ideas, they don't necessarily engage in violence themselves. Some people engage in violence for a whole variety of different reasons, and then they latch onto the ideology actually later on. It's not necessarily the ideology that drives them to it, but it could be a family member. It could be something that has happened to them in their personal life. If recently we had this man from Oklahoma who had employment issues, and then he adopted the horrible tactic of beheading to express his disgust or his personal trauma that he was going through, but he latched onto that at a very late stage again. So these lone wolf actors, it's a very complex process, and one thing I think this also shows, it is difficult to detect in advance, and I think in the later part of the course we'll talk about what I call, what the government calls here, combating violent extremism, probably a pretty bad terminology, but ways we can try to get an early warning system through means other than surveillance and law enforcement intelligence techniques for these kinds of individuals to try to prevent these types of incidents from occurring. So that's all I want to say about Ottawa, and I think it'd be great to open it up to our students who are eagerly waiting to dive in here. So Justin, why don't we start with that?
Looks like Sundar already has a question for you here.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't help wonder about the incident that took place, well, it's now a couple of years ago, in Norway, in Oslo, which is also a terrorist incident by its nature, committed by a person with terrorist views and terrorist ideology, but that was not necessarily linked to religion, but it was linked to National Socialism and Nazism, but the output was the same. So I'm kind of wondering about this necessary link between religious radicalization.
Well, I don't think there is one. I think that you can radicalize, and let's try to use some common terminology. What I mean by the term radicalize is to take on views, opinions about politics and the world that are outside the mainstream, that are on the fringe, and views that may even believe in the use of violence to perpetrate a political end. Now you can radicalize, and then lots of people can hold these views, but only a small fraction of those people might actually ever engage in violence. And then you also might have people who engage in political violence who don't really have strong ideological positions. But that ideology can be a political ideology. It could be, environmental extremism. It could be about your views of economics and capitalism. And these ideologies have driven all kinds of different terrorist organizations throughout the days. I mean, I focus in this course is about 9/11 and its aftermath. So we spend most of our time thinking about this one particular ideology, but that there are many other ideologies that drive people to political violence, and sometimes folks we talk up to Muslims resent that all of the attention is focused on this one type of form of political violence when there are other forms of political violence that are causing grave harm many places around the world. And that's a legitimate criticism. There's only so much we can discuss in one course, and this course is about this particular ideology, and I think given 9/11 and so much of what's happening in the world today, I'm not apologetic for focusing on it. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that other types of non-religious ideologies have been shown time and time again to drive people to violence, and people have used violence to advance those ideas in many, many instances in the past. I don't know if you wanted to follow up or if there's another question.
I think this particular line of reasoning is extremely salient, and it connects to the idea of the difficulty that we still have in really locking down a core or solid definition of terrorism itself. I know that the points that you made at the end of your introduction there, when you were first speaking in the beginning of the Hangout, made me begin to think about the ways in which people perform violence, and if that violence is necessarily connected to an ideology, and what it takes to be formed enough in the ideology to say that the violence that I'm committing is in fact reasonably linked to it. So you mentioned that this gentleman in Ottawa had really been involved in his own practice of Islam for a comparatively very short period of time. And we have this problem then where the word terrorism is perhaps overused or all too eagerly attached to incidents that might not be best described as terrorism itself. So any thoughts on that?
Very fair point. Yes, again, I tried to summarize a huge amount of material from the other course in this week just to kind of get us all on the same page. I'd certainly recommend, if you're really interested in that, to pick up next time we offer it, maybe sometime in 2015, to check that out. Yes, when there's a wide-ranging debate about what terrorism is and is not. You know, I think a lot of people complain that right now we're in a phase that any violence by a Muslim is considered terrorism, and that certainly should be the case. So we don't really even know at this point, and we may never know. This was a violent act by a Muslim, but in some ways it might not be terrorism because it might turn out this guy had no understanding of the ideology that we discussed. He might have had grievances against the Canadian Parliament for some other reason. Or he might have been watching ISIS videos and been convinced that he needed to take action to respond in some way to the Canadian government's activities in Syria. That would be politically motivated violence. It would be an attack against innocent civilians based on a political ideology. And in my view, those are the two core elements of what makes something terrorism. And that doesn't mean that acts of violence that are not taken in an advancement of a political ideology are not important social problems. Certainly, if you look at the horrible incident in Newtown, where we had children and teachers slaughtered by a gunman, that was a form of active shooter, terrible violence against innocent people. I don't really think it was done out of any sort of political motivation or with any linkage to any international trends or history or politics. It was a deeply disturbed individual. Another complaint that often comes up is that when we get ideological violence or things that seem like ideological violence that are perpetrated by non-Muslims, sometimes there seems to be this default to say, oh, it must have been mental illness. And if you look at the Jared Lochner incident, where there was essentially an assassination attempt on a member of Congress in Arizona, and a number of other people were killed. Fortunately, the congresswoman wasn't, but she was severely wounded. That people jumped very quickly to the issue that, that wasn't terrorism. This guy was just terribly mentally disturbed. And I don't want to, weigh or judge the question of that particular individual's mental illness, but I will say that we are, I think, very count the possibility that any Muslim who engages in terror in violence, somehow there's not an investigation of whether mental illness had a role in that person's activities as well. And we should think about that very carefully before, again, jumping to the conclusion that this was an act of ideologically motivated violence, which is terrorism. If anybody will notice, there was a post pretty early on our forum where, about this incident, and I wanted to be careful. I said, listen, I'm not going to comment myself. You've made some good points, because what we learn is that what we learn in the first 10 minutes of an incident and the assumptions that take place more often turn out to be wrong than right. I mean, the Canadian police are now saying that this person didn't have any connection to ISIS, was not a returned fighter, although it appears maybe he was trying to get to Syria. So these things are often very complicated, and we don't really understand them sometimes for many months afterwards, and sometimes, especially when the perpetrator is killed, we actually never get complete insight into what the genuine nature of their motivations were. I hope that answers your question.
Greg, do you have a question there?
Well, I had a very similar question actually to the one that sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, Sundar just asked. Connected with the concept of terrorism, do you think that actually in many cases it might be counterproductive even to use the term, insofar as there's no purely objective or descriptive concept of terrorism? It's always inherently evaluative or subjective. Even if we use a definition like politically or ideologically motivated violence, that's still, of course, open-ended. And if we class acts of violence as terrorism, don't we lend them a certain sort of gravity that they, in a sense, don't deserve?
Well, we use. It's a tough question, and if I'm ever on the media or something happens, that's the first thing that the reporters want to know: was this terrorism? And sometimes I wonder, what difference does it make? The question really is, why did this individual engage in violence, and then what kinds of tools do we have given to understand the motivations, and do we have to try to counteract that? It's interesting. I just had a visit from Professor John Horgan, was visiting with me at Duke, speaking to students and faculty here. And I highly recommend his work, The Psychology of Terrorism, a book called Walking Away from Terrorism. And we discussed a lot of these issues. And he says, the search for motivation is often incredibly difficult, and even researchers like him, who have interviewed hundreds of either current or former, we can call them terrorists, but people who believe in political violence, or using violence to promote ideological goals. He says you can talk to them for hours, and sometimes they don't even know really why they went into the terrorist organization. And the key issue is really how did they enter the organization, because the why doesn't really help us that much with countermeasures. If somebody entered Al-Qaeda because you know, some family member, a distant family member, had been killed in a U.S. drone strike, or another person entered Al-Qaeda because they believe in the concept of the caliphate and want to fight the West to lead to the caliphate, they're both members of Al-Qaeda. They're both going to work to have violence. What difference does it make in trying to construct a counterterrorism policy why they entered the group? More interesting thing is, how did they enter the group? What were the different means that they connected with them? Who recruited them? What things did they read or see that inspired them to do that? How did they make a connection once they got to wherever they were, Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey? Because those are things we can't really have a big influence on what people think as a government. Matter of fact, it's very dangerous, especially in democracies, when we say, well, we're going to have a whole set of policies to try to change how people think about the world. Generally, if you believe in liberal democracy, you don't think that that is a core function of government. But it certainly can be a core function of government to say, okay, well, you know, they had connectivity to this terrorist group through this network of recruiters. These are how that they were financed, and this is how they traveled. And we can look at those kinds of things to try to figure out, okay, how do you prevent people from joining? So, you know, we have to use language in this debate, and the media is going to use the word terrorism, so I don't shy away from it, but I think we should not preoccupy ourselves as much with the why question as we do.
All right. Will, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Is there a risk of terrorism effectively becoming a fungible thing between different organisations? After all, in the aftermath of the tragic events in Ottawa, there was a rush to media speculation about whether this individual was involved with IS or Al-Qaeda, when you have IS fighting an affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria. Is there a concern that the whole thing will just glaze into one single pot of terrorism in the media perception, rather than looking at the individualities of the facts?
Well, I think that's a very good point, Will, and we make a huge mistake when we lump all of these things together. Now, it is true that Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and ISIS may share certain ideas about the way they would like the world to be governed. But the reality is that all of them are spawned, you're nodding your head vigorously in agreement, that's good. All of them arise out of different political conflicts and grievances. And therefore, that's going to affect their actions, and that helps us understand as to why they formed. Okay, sure, Boko Haram does have some of these ideas about how they'd like to see this future state, but a lot of what is happening in Nigeria is based on an interaction between the people in northern Nigeria who feel disenfranchised and adverse to their government, and a government that is not responsive to the people in those regions and has used force in a heavy-handed way. And that has absolutely nothing to do with, you know, bin Laden and Afghanistan and all of that. So I think, you know, we act at our peril. We also, I think, we make the group seem, you know, even more powerful and more of an oppressive force than they truly are if we allow these small incidents to make the world think that, okay, what this one person in Ottawa did is an advancement of everything that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Boko Haram and ISIS and so on are all trying to do. Might they have had some similar ideas, again, about what they'd like a future world to look like? Might they share some of the same notions of grievance against the West? Sure they do. I'm not trying to say it's totally disconnected, but you know, when we kind of lump everything together, we think it gives the impression of a monolithic power that's out there that is this oppressive force that is going to be so difficult to address in any meaningful way, and I think, you know, I don't think that is productive, as your question suggested.
And we just have X joining us. X, can you speak for a moment? Okay, I don't hear you right now. There's a gear icon in the menu at the top of your screen, and that should let you select a microphone. You've muted yourself, but let's unmute you there. Yep. And there's a little gear icon that if you click on that, it will give you some settings and you can choose your microphone.
Justin, you want to give us one of the questions that people wrote?
Yes, I would. Singer, he asks, hasn't it become apparent that by refocusing America's counterterrorism strategy solely on victory over Al-Qaeda, that we have given rise to new and more violent groups, the Islamic State being just one of them, that even Al-Qaeda has denounced?
I don't think so. I mean, just because Al-Qaeda has been the core group that our counter strategy has been aimed at doesn't mean that we've, you know, taken our eye, the United States and other countries around the world, totally taken their eye off of the potentialities of attacks by other organizations. Let's say like Hezbollah is certainly a group that has global reach. I think plenty of effort and resources have been put towards tracking that group and understanding it and trying to prevent it from doing things. But I don't think it's a mistake to say that Al-Qaeda was, especially in the post 9/11 and the pre 9/11 era, was the core threat against the United States. And then in terms of ISIS, I mean, ISIS essentially grew out of the same set of political concerns that from which Al-Qaeda in Iraq spawned after the U.S. invasion. And that political grievance was that the Sunnis, who had been in control of Iraq, found themselves to be being stripped of power and not having any feeling about where they were going to fit in and survive in the new Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was, you know, and there was an effort to foment by Al-Qaeda in Iraq a sectarian civil war that was spiraled out of control. We're going to talk a lot about this in week 2, so I don't want to spoil the excellent videos you're going to see next week. But it was the same set of grievances and fear that they would be dominated by the Shia parts of Iraq that were aligned with Iran that led to the insurgency and then also the advent of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was ultimately defeated after the Sunnis were convinced that they would have a better future if they worked with the United States to form a pluralistic government in Iraq. But in around the 2010-2011 period, the United States became less engaged. The Shia government, majority that had control of Iraq, became less inclusive and more oppressive and using state power against the Sunnis, and then this grievance led to the rise of ISIS. So I don't think the United States wasn't paying attention to ISIS because it thought that the only threat to be worried about was Al-Qaeda. I think it wasn't actively and aggressively dealing with ISIS because it maybe falsely assumed that the Iraqi government would be able to handle this problem on its own, and that the Iraqi army, which indeed we spent over $25 billion training and equipping, was going to be able to manage that problem. It was really that assumption that led to ISIS being so successful, not this idea that, oh, the only thing we got to worry about is Al-Qaeda. I don't think that's correct.
Great. Axe, do you want to try again? Yes, we still cannot hear you, unfortunately.
Maybe he could write in a question.
Yes, if you can use the chat button along the left, upper left corner of your Hangout window. There should be a blue button that you can click on that's to chat. Question following up on the ISIS idea. Do you think that the attacks conducted by the U.S. against ISIS are going to create a new kind of extremism, or at least make Muslims, and especially Sunnis, sympathetic with ISIS?
Well, this is the real conundrum of counterterrorism, isn't it? If you leave the problem alone and you allow the groups to gain this safe haven and for them to spread horror and their ideas and ideology, as ISIS was able to do, clearly that's going to present a problem. But when you do things like use force to try to weaken those groups, spread their power, that can accentuate this idea of grievance that has driven many people to believe in these ideas and to join these groups. So there you have it, the difficulty of counterterrorism. So I do believe that in some instances you have no choice but to use force to weaken these groups. But for counterterrorism to be really successful, it has to be linked with a whole other set of strategic ideas to undermine the core grievances that are leading people to join these groups. And that can range from economic development and better communications and the development of alliances. So that's why I think it's very, very important, at least in this instance, that this is not just a Western coalition that is fighting against ISIS, but that it is with regional partners in the area that are also see this group as a severe threat to safety, security, and ultimately prosperity in the region. So that helps frame this as not a battle between the West oppressing a specific group of Sunni Muslims, but if Sunni Muslims, whether they be from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or Jordan, are also fighting against this group, that shows that this is really a fight between people who believe in a modern world, who believe in religious pluralism, although there's a question about how much the Saudis believe in religious pluralism, but are against the barbarism and the gang rape and all the things that ISIS is engaged in. It's people who believe in the, I would say, modernism versus the kind of antiquated, backwards-looking view of the world that ISIS presents. I think that's a much more palatable frame, and that helps take us out of the conundrum that your question very accurately raised.
And David, do you know if there's some idea of where ISIS gets its financial resources from?
Well, ISIS is in a lot of ways different from Al-Qaeda because it's been able to capture such a large swath of territory. And although ISIS uses terroristic tactics, I've written an article, you can look it up on the Huffington Post, where I say that ISIS is not quote terrorism problem, because in a lot of ways it's a lot bigger than the terrorism problem. ISIS is a smallish army that has been able to capture territory and then combine kind of classical military tactics with the tactics of terrorism and terrifying a civilian population into supporting it by using assassination, rape, ethnic cleansing, religious cleansing, and so on. In capturing territory, it's been able to capture resources. So it's been able to sink its teeth into the whole illicit trade in oil in the region, and it's been able to gain money by that way. It has been able to loot, take control of banks in places like Mosul, and grab large amounts of hard currency. So those are the sources that where ISIS is getting a lot of its funding, because they've grabbed territory that has the ability to generate funding. We have a new
question.
Participant.
Yes, and Mike has joined us. But Axe has posted his question. He says, I'm very interested in the perception of terrorism. Do you make any moral difference between the sanitized poisoning of Socrates?
I'm sorry, Justin, you cut out there. I didn't hear the end of the question.
Sorry.
After the Socrates quote.
The sanitized poisoning of Socrates and the public assassination of Westerners by ISIS.
Well, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question,
perhaps he's the second one a terrorist activity, while the first one is not viewed in that way by history.
Yeah. You know, because of others that have asked questions before, one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. But over time, we've developed ideas that are often reflected in international law that taking up arms against a state, even if it's a civil war, if you have a large enough group, if you have a movement that has some legitimacy, and you use tactics that don't target civilians, that those are more legitimate ways to air grievances. Terrorist tactics, which is the use of violence against totally innocent people. Now, let's also understand, and I think this is where some people get confused. When we're talking about Al-Qaeda as terrorism, that's one form of terrorism, which is non-state actor terrorism. There's no doubt that state entities use terrorist tactics as well, and certainly what the Assad regime has been doing by using force against civilians to try to quell the uprising is state terrorism. And a colleague of mine, we discussed this in the first course, so we did a Google Hangout with Martin Miller. I think you can even look it up, Justin, on our website. This was from last year. He's written a book where he just talks about that a lot of the source of the grievance that brings about terrorism is the interaction between state terrorism, where states oppress civilian groups that are challenging its power, and then those groups then lash out and use terrorist tactics to try to weaken the state. And it's the cycle back and forth that generates these problems. So by my focus, again, on Al-Qaeda and non-state actor terrorism, please don't lead me to come to the view that I believe that this state terrorism is not an important issue and doesn't have a lot to do with the problems that we're facing. But I will say I do think we can make distinctions between, if you were looking on the non-state side, I do think we can make distinctions between legitimate political / insurgent movements that use violence to try to bring about political change, and terrorist organizations that have very small levels of following and use fear and violence and all kinds of horrific tactics against civilians to try to make their point.
So we have two new people joining us. Mike, do you have a question you would like to ask?
Yeah, I guess as a follow-up to that, I had a couple questions. I guess is that when you talk about state terror, state-based terrorism, is it referring to terrorism inside the state, or one state conducting that against another state? And related is so cyber espionage kind of activities then between states also considered terrorism?
I mean, I don't think espionage is a different thing from terrorism. I mean, all states engage in espionage. I think we're going to talk about a lot of the NSA, Edward Snowden things in either week 5 or week 6, if I recall. So spying is spying. Now, cyber ultimately can be used to try to attack infrastructure. Violence against property is certainly a form of terrorism, but it's usually considered a lesser evil in many ways than violence against people. But then, of course, violence against property that can actually lead to civilian harm, and let's say you can somehow bring down a electrical grid or that controls a water facility, and somehow that leads to massive flooding. Or something like that. So cyber activities could potentially lead to civilian catastrophe, and that's what makes a lot of people worried in the modern world. So I'm not discounting that could take place. Now, your first question was whether state-based terrorism had to be could be within a country or between countries. So certainly we've had state-sponsored terrorism where states are the ones that are supporting non-state actors to execute terrorist attacks. And of course we've seen a lot of that with against the United States, with different countries in the Middle East sponsoring groups that were, for example, bombing the Marine barracks in Lebanon, or the Khobar Towers incident, or many other things. So states can certainly try to use terrorist tactics by funding and providing political support to these non-state actors, and states can also, try to quell a civilian rebellion inside their own country by using the tactics of fear and fighting and killing civilians. Let's look at the Syria situation. There's a rebellion against them, and the state, certainly under international law, does not have to allow an armed rebellion to take place and not fight back. But they have to be under the exact same rules, and we're going to talk about this in week 2 as to what those rules are relating to targeting. You can target, if there's an insurrection and insurgency against you, you can target the military power that's being used against you under international law. You don't have to allow a revolution to take place if you're a state. But what you can't do is use force indiscriminately such that large amounts of civilian casualties occur. Once you do that, you are committing war crimes, you're violating international law, but I would also argue you're using the tactics of terror to deal with the political situation.
So does that mean there's
take place?
Does that mean there's a line that at which civilians are no longer civilians?
Well, there you get into the question that Israel faces in Gaza, where if you have whether you call them insurgents or terrorists, you have Hamas fighters who weave themselves deeply into the civilian population, making it much more difficult for them to be hit without civilian casualties being inflicted. And that is a very difficult question. Under international law, force is allowed to be used against civilians who are directly participating in hostilities, DPH. We're going to have a lecture that touches on that in the coming weeks. So that is a very dicey, tricky issue. How do you determine when somebody is who's a teacher or a farmer during the day and is making bombs during the night? When is that person crossed the line from becoming a civilian to a participant, a combatant? Combatants can be targeted, civilians cannot. And terrorism, non-state terrorism, and even insurgency can blur those lines, and that's what makes conflict in the modern world very messy. World War I was easier to figure out who was the enemy and who were the combatants and who were the civilians. In the modern world, it's much harder.
Thank you.
Eric, you joined us at the end here. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
No, I don't. I'm actually just enjoying the conversation. Thanks.
All right. Great.
Justin, I'd like to say a word for folks who are viewing online who can't get in, and also for the students in the class who are going to watch this later. Mm-hmm. I just can't tell you how impressed I am with the caliber of the dialogue that's going on in the discussion forums. This year we tried to channel some of that dialogue by asking specific questions rather than letting the discussion forums go off in multiple directions. And I'm totally fine with the other discussion forums that are ones that I haven't posed the question. But you know, I just want to compliment everybody. You're doing great. You're grappling with the hard issues. I've been looking at your materials, and yeah, there are no easy answers. So keep up the good work, and I hope you're enjoying that back and forth, because that's how we get to deeper understanding, is by kind of sharing our views and writing, being forced to kind of articulate our questions and our views on these subjects. But I'm happy to take a couple more questions from folks if they want to dive in again, Justin.
Yes, let me find the one here. There's a question from a student living in the European Union who asks, or says first, I have a feeling that there is a lack of coordination about counterterrorism policy. The coordination organized between the U.S. and the EU about counterterrorism.
Well, I have to say I don't have a huge amount of direct insight into this. My strong impression from listening to other people talk about it is a disagreement with the questioner. I think, and on an intelligence basis, you know, for example, one of the big problems with 9/11, as the 9/11 Commission points out, was even within the United States, a lack of information sharing. And I was just at a conference in Texas last week where we're at 10 years after the 9/11 Commission report came out and Congress passed a very big sweeping intelligence reform that really the main thrust of which is that intelligence had to be shared more broadly between the community, different agencies within the U.S., and I think part and parcel with that was the need and the value of information sharing between other countries. So the United States has a very widespread intelligence capability, as we've learned a lot through the Edward Snowden leaks, and we'll talk about. But many countries in Europe find that a lot of that information to be incredibly valuable, and I believe that there is a lot of sharing that goes on, and it goes in both directions. The United States does not have the same kind of insight into these problems as the individual countries there do, so they're collecting information and sharing it with us as well. Now, I think you could get a impression that there's not a lot of coordination when we look at, for example, the differing views that countries in Europe are taking with respect to how to deal with the ISIS problem. So that's not just CT. I mean, that is foreign policy and issues relating to the use of willingness to use force, resources. So those are complicated issues, and you wouldn't expect a diverse set of countries to be totally unified right out the gate on those issues. So like any foreign policy issue, we're struggling to get people to have common goals and share in the burden and agree upon tactics, but coalition building is tough work, and that's what's going on between the U.S. and Europe on those issues right now.
And I have one last round us out here today. Considering the issues with both the military and the criminal justice paradigms, should we look to create a third option to deal with terrorism, both as a concept and as a threat?
Well, great question, and that's a really good place to leave off, because I think that will get us thinking about the issues to come. Hopefully, one of the themes that will emerge is that the existing laws and paradigms that we pull from at different times are not completely adequate for dealing with this particular problem. But that begs the question: what would it mean to have a third full paradigm that is the terrorism paradigm? Very difficult to do that. In some ways, we are, at least in the United States, when we craft these new laws like the Intelligence Reform or maybe the Patriot Act, that is blending notions of the law and crime paradigm. Those are examples, perhaps, of that emerging. But let's understand that these law and crime paradigms have been around for centuries, and 9/11 took place 13 years ago. So we're still early, really, historically, in the evolution, and countries are grappling. There is not consensus, for example, that in some countries that international terrorism, that there's even a place for wartime-like use of force. So that's a tough debate, and that kind of understanding would have to precede the question of the development of a separate set of laws and policies and ethics to cover counterterrorism. International law, we're going to discuss next week, talks about civilians and combatants. Well, when you have terrorism, that is, as we just discussed in this last question, a lot of people in the United States say, well, they are, of course, combatants and should be treated that way under the law of war. But international law says a combatant is only a regular kind of army that wears a uniform and has a command structure, and everybody else is a civilian. And well, you can target civilians who are participating in hostilities, but we're going to look at them as a part of a civilian population. Well, that's a long way from a third paradigm of how to deal with terrorism. So it's a great question. It doesn't have an answer. But I hope you'll continue to think about that, because next week we're really going to start launching into these issues. We're going to be looking at use of force questions, so we're going to be more in the war paradigm next week, and then we'll gravitate more towards the law enforcement kind of approaches later on in the course. So great questions this morning. I really enjoyed talking with everyone, and I'm glad I got to chat directly with some of the students who are taking this course and enjoying the first week of the class. I certainly have.
Great. Thanks to all of you for joining us, all of you viewing as well, and we'll make sure to put this also up on the course site so that everyone can see it within the classes too. Thanks again for your participation, and we'll see you on Coursera.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.